So how many people here watch reality TV at all? Reality TV shows? It's one of my best accomplishments.
Depends on what you mean by reality TV.
Good question. But you know how when you're watching one of those shows, they bring you right up to the climactic moment, and then they cut away to a commercial? Yeah. And then when you come back, they spend time recapping everything that brought you up to that moment, even though you literally just saw it like a minute ago. Drives me crazy. It really does. But if it's any comfort for you, I have a plan for the director who came up with that idea in the first place. Now, professional ethics don't allow me to say much. But let's just say it involves an afterlife spent emptying out the Atlantic Ocean with a teaspoon. Walking over a beach littered with broken bottles and snapping turtles. That seems like a fair fate for that person. But I digress. In our case, it has been a week. It's not just been a minute, but it's been a week since we talked about Job, so I figure I should bring you back up to speed. See how it all ties in? So we have Job of Uz, upright, uptight, boring citizen, always faithful to God, blah, blah, blah. And then we have God, creator of the universe in general and human beings in particular. And God could not stop bragging about Job. How Job was so faithful, and he would never turn his back on God, and he would never renounce God, and you could never get him to do that. And I knew better, of course, because I know humans. I know your weaknesses. Humans are sort of my thing. So after I listened to it for long enough, I called God out, and he agreed that I could put that faith to the test. And I did. I nailed Job about as hard as you could hit somebody. I took his wealth, I took his kids, I took his health. And even after all that, he was still just hanging on by a thread. And then his best friends came along to help him. And in the course of helping him, they tried to convince Job that, gosh, you must have done something wrong to deserve all this. It has to be your fault. You must have done something to God to deserve punishment. And after long enough of that, from his friends, Job broke. He called out God and he said, "How dare you do this to me, God? You owe me an explanation, and you owe it to me right now." And maybe because Job was special to God, or maybe because God was just in the right frame of mind when that challenge came, or maybe even because his special pet human Job was starting to get under his skin a little bit, God actually answered that challenge. Well, technically, it wasn't really an answer. It was more of this cosmic smackdown that happened. I think we have a video. to Job. It was beautiful to see. And right there, right at that precise moment, is where Job failed me. Because right at that moment is where Job had the perfect opportunity to follow through on his challenge to God. Even after all that, that is the point where Job could have had the chance to speak up for every one of you miserable sacks of woe and regret. And be the voice of every human being who's ever suffered an inexplicable loss or couldn't understand how God could let something bad happen to them. Here's where Job could have stood up for all of you and told God that he could just can that whole "I don't have to answer to you because I'm God" routine. What does Job do? He rolls over like a little puppy. And he whimpers. I have questioned you about things that I can't understand. I've spoken of things too wonderful for me, which I do not know. I'm sorry, God, I despise myself for even asking these questions. Rub my belly, please. Yeah, that's what he did. Job finally gets his shot at the title here, and his response is to go, don't hurt me, bro. I didn't mean it. It was the devil, that other guy. It was frustrating. Let's just say that. But I'll tell you what, Job may think that he was given a glimpse of things too wonderful for him. But let me tell you, I've been behind the curtain. I know what's what, and I know who's who, and those things are not too wonderful for me. But maybe it's time I filled you in case you don't know. Let's start with the obvious. I am not the bad guy here. I know people hear Satan, and immediately you all have this mental picture. Satan, ooh, scary, Halloween, Truth is, Satan's not even my name. Satan is a job title. Satan means accuser in Hebrew, or prosecutor. And it's not even pronounced Satan, honestly, it's pronounced Satan, but try and convince anyone of that nowadays. Hey, my name's Satan. Yeah, sure it is. But I'm a prosecutor. I'm one of the good guys. I'm practically a saint. You know how back at the very beginning of time, God created the universe? And he saw that it was good? You remember that back from Genesis? God did this, he saw that it was good. God did that, he saw that it was good. Sometime after that, God created me. I was sort of the quality control department for the universe. I would go throughout the universe and I would look for flaws and weaknesses and I would bring them to God to be judged. That was my part. Particularly after humans came along. My job was to test humans. But after the first few millennia of quality control work on the human race, I started to, let's just say I started to enjoy it a little bit too much. I started to find a certain amount of satisfaction when people would listen to me And I think that's because you were his pet project. And whenever I could find a flaw in a human being, or if I could find a way to facilitate the things they were already thinking about, you know what those are, I would do it. I would jump right in, help them over the cliff, and I would enjoy it. But still, I never made anybody do anything they hadn't already thought of. I just kind of greased the wheels for them. Made a few suggestions along the way. I made it easier, just to show I was a good guy. Now here's another thing you may not have thought of. This one might, blow your minds a little bit. When you think about it, God created sin. Or at least God made sin possible. Now I know what you're thinking. Heresy. You think I'm going to move back a little bit so when the lightning comes, it's not going to get me. But connect the dots here. Follow along with me. Back in the garden, God gave you a gift. Back in the garden, after God molded and shaped you and breathed spirit into you, God also imparted into the human race this little thing called free will. A great gift. Free will means you have the ability to choose to be faithful to God or to turn away from what God wants you to do. You have the ability to choose to be with God or to be apart from God. And theologians will tell you that sin is whatever keeps you apart from God. So that means God gave you the ability to sin or to be obedient. But he gave you that ability to sin. So ipso facto, as my Roman friends would say, God created sin. Why? Why would God do that? It's like Henry Ford saying, you know what, I'm going to design a car that can do 50 miles an hour on an open road, but every once in a while the brakes are going to fail for no apparent reason. Why would God make you that way? And I think it's because he was lonely. I'll explain that. I tried, back when God was talking about this, I tried to show him the folly of his plan. And after he actually went ahead and did it back in the garden, I tried to convince God that it was not really a good idea. And if you recall, I didn't exactly have to strong-arm Adam or Eve into going against God's single commandment. I just pointed out a few things here and there, and they did it themselves. Even after they showed that they couldn't be trusted, they showed that human beings could not be trusted to even obey the simplest rule, and it doesn't get much simpler than, hey, eat anything you want, but don't eat that. Even after they showed they were incapable of that, God wouldn't give up. God wouldn't stop loving you. He wouldn't stop giving you chances. And it just gnawed at me. I've never asked him why. It's just too frustrating a topic. But Here's what I've observed. In all the universe, remember 100 billion galaxies, 100 billion stars in each, who knows how many planets. In all of that, a lot of it is inanimate. What's left, a lot of it is non-sentient. It doesn't think. Like a worm or a micro network executive. Out of all that undoubted, incredible glory that springs from God's creative spirit, there was nothing there that could love him back. God could love his creation, but it couldn't love him back. And there was nothing to return that feeling until you came along. You and your free will. Because part of having the ability to love means you have to have the ability to choose not to love. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. God didn't want robots. He wanted creatures who would understand him for who he is and love him because they wanted to. So he gambled on you. Apparently God was not Methodist because he gambled. Maybe it was worth playing the lottery in this case. God made you capable of saying no so that you could say yes and it would mean something to him. And God has spent the last umpteen thousand years trying to show you how much he loves you despite the things that you do. He has spent the last umpteen thousand years trying to reconnect that bond with you that you broke when you chose to sin. You people have no idea how lucky you are. And that's what I have a hard time understanding. Because if you really understood how much love God has invested in you, you would never even think of going against God's word. If you really understood how much God cared for you, you would trip over yourselves trying to get back to him when you strayed. If you really understood how much God cared for you, you would look at your neighbors differently because you realize that God loved them too. No, you go through your lives thinking that what you want in your life somehow constitutes a natural law. You go through your lives thinking that if God really loved you, you'd have this pristine, faultless life in which nothing ever went wrong and there was never any pain. And the fact that you expect that is good for me. It's good for business, because when the hard times come along, that's when people start to fall away. Guys, it's the pain that tells you you're part of the universe. It's the pain that tells you that you exist, that you are part of the natural order of things that God created. And it's the tears that you shed that remind you that there is still comfort to be found in the arms of a loving God. Living life as God's children does not insulate you from the bad things, but it does connect you to the hope and grace that the Lord offers you, if you will just take it. catch is, if you're going to accept the love of God, then you're going to have to reflect the love of God. That's why at the very end of the book of Job, we see Job did that. Because God was displeased with his friends, Larry, Moe, and Hurley. His friends that had pushed him over the edge, God really was not too fond of what they did, and Job prayed for them. He stepped in, he interceded with God, and he said, God, they're not bad folks. Don't be mad at them. And that was a reflection of Job rediscovering God's love. But if you ask me, it's not worth it. Because that takes work. It takes hard work. And it takes commitment. It takes commitment to reflect God's love. So instead of that, put your faith in something a little more immediate. Money's always good. Power. Can't go wrong with power. But look at me. I'm taking all this time to tell you about how Job messed me up by turning back to God. But honestly, all it cost me is a little bit of time. A few more gray hairs. And a Snuggie. I had to get God a Snuggie. I just couldn't figure that out. The thing is, I could be spending my time much more productively. Speaking to you human beings one-on-one. In fact, I have an appointment in Washington. Something about an election coming up, so I have to go there shortly. But I do hope to see you again sometime. And the next time you hear, this is a favor I ask, the next time you hear that voice in your head saying, just go ahead and do what you want. Who's it going to hurt? Do me a favor and save us all some time. Just say yes. And then I'll be seeing you.